Good morning, everyone. Looks like we're on the tail end of a traveling weekend, and not all of the crowd is back yet. So our prayers are for safety while everybody is returning home after the long weekend. Glad to see this number with us. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 40, beginning a 3-chapter sprint through this detailed story of Joseph, with a little bit of cleanup from last week. And I'd like to touch on Psalm 105 here in just a minute as well. Come on in. So, like I said, I'd like to go back to Psalm 105. Last week we had 2 questions left. Psalm 105, there's a few places in the Bible where these Old Testament stories, these patriarch stories, are recounted for us. And I guess as we're studying through it, I've found a new appreciation for these types of retellings, because sometimes you get a little bit more information from the Holy Spirit retelling the story than what you got even from the book of Genesis. In Psalm 105, beginning in verse 8, just backing up a little bit, you've got these kind of 7 or 8 verse stanzas in this psalm, but verse 8, he says, "He has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, the covenant which he made with Abraham, and his oath to Isaac. Then he confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance. When they were only a few men in number, very few, and strangers in it, and they wandered about from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he permitted no man to oppress them, and he reproved kings for their sakes. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm." I like that stanza because he's recounting most of what we've studied in the book of Genesis so far, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you see there the protection that God was giving to these men, right? Sometimes maybe we take it for granted. Well, sure, they're strangers and exiles in a foreign land. God says, I will give this land to you, but it's not their land. And they encountered peoples much larger than their small family. And what does it say that he did for them?
He protected them. He permitted no one to do them wrong.
Yeah, verse 15, do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. Even that word prophet stands out to me, that these men were prophets in the sense that, I'll ask you, in what sense were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob prophets? No?
They were transmitters of God's will by either actions or their words. And of course, they're passing it along orally to their families, which is what a prophet does. A prophet is just an oracle of God.
Yeah, when they received these promises, this is what was going to happen on the earth. God was going to bless all nations through their seed, through their family. And so that's a prophecy. And we shouldn't miss that fact. Now Joseph, as we move into Joseph, he becomes a prophet because he receives dreams. And he's going to speak, as we'll notice in the story, just seamlessly revealing God's word. There's not a, hold on, Pharaoh, I need to go pray and see if God will tell me the interpretation. No, he hears the dream and tells him what how God interprets the dream. No different from an inspired man, even in the New Testament, the way Paul might respond, right? Knowing the will of God. And so God has given Joseph his spirit in that sense, where he knows, he has the mind of God to be able to answer these men. Notice verses 16 through 24. Now speaking of God, he called for a famine upon the land. He broke the whole staff of bread. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him, the ruler of peoples, and set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler over all his possessions, to imprison his princes at will, that he might teach his elders wisdom. Israel also came into Egypt. Thus Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham, and he caused his people to be very fruitful, and made them stronger than their adversaries. So you have this retelling of the story of Joseph. What does it say God did with Joseph? Verse 17 says he sent a man before them. Joseph wasn't like Paul in the sense that, Jesus said, I need you to go and preach the gospel. Joseph didn't know he was being sent, but that's exactly what God was doing. He sends a man before them, essentially to redeem the people, the whole world, and makes him Lord over his house. But I wanted you to notice some of the conditions of Joseph's imprisonment. Now, remember from last week's study, why was Joseph imprisoned?
He was wrongly accused of
trying to rape Potiphar's wife. That's right.
Potiphar's wife was trying to lie with him, and now she's got his cloak because he fled, and she uses that to be able to say, your slave. It sounds very much like Adam, who says, the woman you gave me did this. I think Marissa pointed that out last week, but the idea there is, your slave, you brought this slave into my house, and now he's come in to try to rape me. And so Potiphar imprisons him. And so he's in prison unfairly. But what were the conditions? And this is a little bit more detail than you get in Genesis, because it immediately goes to the fact that Joseph rose to be head of the prison, right? The chief jailer puts Joseph in charge. But does that mean he had an easy time there?
What does it say in Psalm 105?
That he was physically restrained. His feet were afflicted with fetters, and he was laid in irons.
Right? Yeah, so I don't know how that worked, because it says,
Nothing was done in the prison except that Joseph did it. So there was a time, I suppose, where he's made more free to be able to go about and do the things that needed done, taking care of the things for the chief jailer and giving the other slaves their food and things like that. But then back to the stocks, I suppose. So it says they afflicted his feet with fetters. There's nothing pleasant about being in this dungeon. Probably wasn't a very clean place, right? Just an awful place to be, a place that he didn't deserve to be. You may notice some parallels with Jesus in this story, right? That he was, we were listening to a song on the way to church this morning that talks about Jesus. He was despised. He was rejected. Was Joseph despised? Hated by his brothers? Rejected? Goes through this time of great difficulty where it seems like you might conclude God has forsaken me, right? I'm just stuck in this prison, suffering. But as we'll see from today's lesson, he is then highly exalted and placed at the right hand of who? Pharaoh, the king. At the king's right hand, just echoing these themes from the story of Christ, who was exalted to the right hand of God. It's a beautiful story, and we see those elements of Christ's exaltation in different Old Testament stories, but I don't see as many of those elements as we do here in Joseph, in the story of Joseph, where he was this rejected son who is then exalted to the right hand of the king. So how did the word of the Lord, as it said in Psalm 105, how did the word of the Lord test? Or one translation in the margin of my Bible it says, verse 19, until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested him. How would have this been like a test for Joseph? Francis?
To see how faithful he was, even though he was in a situation that most people wouldn't be faithful.
right? Yeah.
Another element of Christ is that he was silent, right? He did not open his mouth to declare, this is unjust, right? And I noticed that same thing through most of these stories of Joseph. You don't get much of a comment from him about how unjust this is. Only in the story of the cupbearer and the baker does he finally speak up and say, hey, say something to the Pharaoh because I'm unjustly in this prison. This isn't fair. But he's not complaining. He's simply seeing this as a potential opportunity to get out. Sam?
But Joseph also had his dreams, much earlier, I assume, in his life, that he was promised these things, and whatever his understanding of those was could affect whether or not he was presently being tested by God. Whether he would trust that the Lord would provide these things for him eventually, or if he was tricked or deceived in some way. I think in that way he was put to the test.
That's right. Put to the
Test, and similar to all the patriarchs who received a promise, and then there's some time. I think Dad mentioned that in one of his lessons, that there's this time that elapses, and that's a test. Am I going to believe that God's going to keep his promise? And so he receives that dream at a young age, 17, and by the time he stands before Pharaoh, how old is he?
About 40? No.
Here's the number, 30, right? 30.
So 17 years before he stands before Pharaoh, and this starts to come to pass. So that would have been a test. And even the word refine is there as a possible translation. It reminds me of, even with Christ, what did it say? Hebrews 5:8 says he learned obedience through the things which he suffered, right? And so even Jesus, it's not like he didn't know what obedience was and didn't know what it was going to mean to obey, but in going through the sufferings, just like we do suffer, he learned what obedience to a father is firsthand. He experienced that. And Joseph had to go through suffering as well in order to demonstrate faithfulness to God. It's easy to be faithful when everything's going right, but when things go wrong, will you be faithful then? So he was certainly tested and refined. And we see a great faith that comes forward. Norm?
And like you were just saying, human nature makes us desire the easy path, but it's only through the hard path that the growth occurs. And so we talk about, it's so easy to be faithful, when things are easy. We're kind of missing the boat there when we think that way, and it's easy to think that way. Because God designed this system as such. Athletes, muscles, brains, only grow when tested. And I like the word refinement there from the standpoint you think of metal. And the way getting the impurities out of it over, and you have to burn it and melt it over and over again and work it until you get this final product that's pure.
Which kind of gets to that last question.
Of the ups and downs of life, right? There's ups and downs in Joseph's life. He's his father's favorite son. He's doing pretty well. But then he's despised by his brothers and sold into slavery. He is the head of Potiphar's house because of his faithful behavior, and God is with him, and then he's thrown in prison because of a lie. And he's maybe interpreting these dreams, but then he's forgotten by the cupbearer, and so it's up and down and up and down. Do we experience those types of ups and downs in our lives? Maybe not to that extreme, but we've got our ups and downs. Got a time where you feel like you're on cloud 9 and everything's going good, and boy, it seems like you got to watch out when that happens. Maybe you're being set up for something by the devil because you start maybe potentially trusting in yourself and forgetting God, because then a great trial is going to come. And it's hard to get through that next moment, but we need it. It's this testing and refining of what's most precious to God, which is our hearts, making us stronger. So James 1, what's it say? Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, and sometimes we say, well, nobody's ever really happy when they're going through a trial. But it says to at least be joyful. Joy is that inner confidence of, that things are good. It's not doubting God, why would you do this to me? No, I'm going through a trial. This is going to make me stronger. It'll give me the endurance that I want. And so be joyful for that, because it'll do me good. So let's move on to today's lesson. We've got 3 chapters to cover. We'll see how far we get. Now Joseph, who has received 2 dreams of his own in his younger years, is in the prison, and there's 2 men who have dreams of their own. You think God's involved here? Yeah, I think there's no doubt. It doesn't say God sends them the dreams, but they both had a dream on the same night in the location where a man who can interpret dreams happens to be. You see the providence of God all the way. God is raising up Joseph through these actions. And so he sends these 2 dreams. What were the dreams? And, let's start there.
We've got two men with dreams. Yeah?
Well, we have the cupbearer and the baker. The cupbearer dreamed that he saw a vine. I think the vine had 3 branches, and it produced ripe grapes. And then he squeezed those grapes to juice and filled Pharaoh's cup.
Okay. Right.
Okay, you
Then
want
the
to
baker has a dream. Someone else wants to relate that one? Sam?
Yeah, the baker dreamt that he had 3 baskets or 3
You can do baskets.
baskets of white bread on his head. And there was a whole lot of bread in the top basket, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on top of his head.
Right. And he's pretty encouraged by Joseph's interpretation to the cupbearer, and wants to hear the interpretation of his dream. So the cupbearer's interpretation, first of all, notice verse 8. You see the faithfulness of Joseph, where he says, do not interpret.
Interpretations belong to God. Tell it to me, please. So he's always recognizing that these things are coming from God, not some wisdom of his own. And so he wants to know the interpretations. The 2 men are depressed, and he notices their sadness. Waldron points out probably that these were great officials in the court of the Pharaoh, and if they had just not been in prison, they could have gotten interpretations from Pharaoh's wise men. But they're now stuck in this prison, can't talk to anybody wise about these troubling dreams, and so they're depressed about it. They don't know what these dreams mean. And so the cupbearer's dream is a good interpretation, right? What does Joseph point out? Francis?
The 3 days were the days that he would be reinstated to the position of cupbearer.
Yeah. It's just
Restored to your office. Notice the parallels, obviously. He's the cupbearer, meaning he puts the cup into the Pharaoh's hand. That means he's highly trusted not to poison what the Pharaoh's about to drink. And the idea that, very common, you would literally squeeze the grapes into the cup so that Pharaoh could drink, right? Something so that it's completely fresh and no risk. And so that's exactly what happens. But yeah, the number 3 shows up in both dreams. And here it was just 3 branches. If you were interpreting that dream, would you have seen that to be 3 days? No. I get to that in kind of our second question. What parts of the interpretations could not have been known without divine help? That's one of them. 3 branches are 3 days. Oh. And he's going to be restored to his office. So the baker's encouraged by that. Okay, now tell me the interpretation of my dream. He's got a 3. He's got 3 baskets. And what's the interpretation here?
In 3 days, he would be hanged.
in 3 days he will be hanged. Yeah, it says
That his head will be lifted up from him. So his head would be removed and his body would be hanged. One thing about the word hanged in the Bible is we think of hanged, by a noose. wasn't really invented for many centuries after this, that people started executions by rope. This was the idea of a body being hanged on a stake or on a tree, and it says that the birds, what does it say, verse 17, the birds that were eating out of that basket, verse 19, the birds will eat your flesh off of you. Just a gruesome death. That's why it's stated in the law, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. Just the idea that you see that man, that body being hung out for everybody to see, the shame, and then for such a gruesome death where the animals and the birds eat your flesh. And so just a gruesome interpretation. And the third day, which happened to be a special day in the kingdom, it was Pharaoh's birthday. And I guess because it's his birthday, part of the celebration was, well, let's do some good and let's execute some justice. So they decide to restore one man and execute the other, just as Joseph had said. I asked you this question on question 2. How does Pharaoh lift up the head of both men? Sam?
You kind of already mentioned like the separation of the head from the body for the baker, but when I read this, I think of Psalm 3, how David says that the Lord is a lifter of his head, and when I read that, I think of restoration. That's what I think David is referring to. I'm sure there's more depth to it, but I guess in this context as well, Pharaoh is restoring the cupbearer to his position and is extending what I believe to be mercy in that case. That's what I read.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot in that phrase. It's used throughout here. I'm not stretching it at all. It's verse 20 where it says, he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. And just like how Joseph had said in the dream interpretations that Pharaoh would lift up each of their heads in each cases, you think about the idea of bowing before a king. The whole idea of bowing is you're averting your gaze, you're offering your neck, right, to that man. He can kill you or he can do what he wants with you. And so to lift up the head of one who has bowed can be two things. It can be, okay, that you don't need to bow to me, I'm going to do something good for you. Or, here we have this kind of play on words, that you can take the head. That person has humbled themselves, and yes, I'm greater than you as the ruler of the land, and I'm going to execute you for what you've done. And so that's exactly what he does for these two men. And so here Joseph does ask for the favor of the cupbearer. When you're restored, don't forget me. Verse 14, only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me in the dungeon. Does the cupbearer remember him? No, he gets restored, and I'm sure that's a happy day for him, and he forgets his promise. And is that a good example for us, question 3? Obviously not. What does Jesus teach us that we should do?
It reminds me of the 10 lepers and only one came back to thank Jesus.
Yeah.
Where are the other 9?
Big connection. You're so overjoyed with your
Fortunate circumstances that you forget the one who helped you. And in fact, it wasn't Joseph, it was God. And so he's forgetting God who gave the dream, who gave this good interpretation, but yes, also offending Joseph. So he sins against Joseph, sins against God, forgets him. And it's neat that later in the story he brings that up. He remembers his mistake. What does Christ teach us in Matthew 5:37?
Let your yes be yes and your no be no.
right. There's not even a reason to get an oath. You shouldn't even need to say, I promise. Okay? Even though we don't put promise in the category of oaths or swearing,
If you say it, you mean it.
Yeah, and people should learn that about you.
That if he says he's going to do it, he's going to do it. No reason to doubt. That's, the New Testament talks about let a man who wants to serve as a deacon first be tested, right? Yeah, this is part of that test. Is the man known for one? If he's given an assignment, he does it faithfully. That would be an important part of the test. But all of us should be held to that standard and demonstrate that in our lives. So chapter 41, we have Pharaoh, who receives 2 dreams. It says at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And of course, we remember that it's God who's sending these dreams. And so God's setting this timeline. He could have given Pharaoh this dream the next day, but he waits 2 years. So again, you see that testing and refining. Is Joseph going to despair? Is he going to forget God? Is he going to curse God and die the way Job's wife told him to? No, he's just patiently waiting for what happens next. So Pharaoh receives 2 dreams, and the question skips a bit ahead into the story, but no one's able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. He tells them the dreams. He receives 2 dreams, and these 2 dreams are represented here by this picture that we have up this week. We've got the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows. Where did those cows come from in the dream?
The Nile.
It came up out of the Nile.
Whenever we get these heavenly visions, I'm just trying to catalog these details because it helps with later studies that are a little harder in our Bibles. You're going to see the same thing in the visions of Daniel, also in the book of Revelation, where you've got these beasts coming up out of the sea. And so there's this place of mystery and chaos and things that we don't understand, and these beasts coming out. So here you see beasts coming out of the river. And here you've got 7 fat cows, 7 skinny cows, but don't miss the action in the story. So we have these 2 groups of cows, but then what happens?
The skinny cows eat fat cows.
Yeah. And Pharaoh knows when he relates the dream that
They didn't even get fatter. They were still just as skinny and ugly as before, but these skinny cows are going to eat the fat cows. Strange action. You wouldn't expect them to win that battle. And then the same with the second dream with the ears of grain or ears of corn. 7 of them that are fat and full, and then 7 that are scorched and weak and worthless. But then there's a consuming, right? By the latter consuming the former, right? And no one can interpret these dreams. So then you get this confession, right? The cupbearer who's there in the court says that he knows a man who can help. He says, verse 9 of chapter 41, I would make mention today of my own offenses, right? So he recognizes that he has sinned, and he recounts the case of his dreams and how, verse 12, now a Hebrew youth was with us there. It's another interesting point I noticed here is the use of this word Hebrew already being used. Was there a nation of Israel just to the north of Egypt at this point? We're not there yet. How big is this family? Less than 70, right? You got Jacob and his 12 sons, and the Egyptians don't know them yet. But it was also in chapter 40 that he kind of introduces himself to the cupbearer and the baker. Verse 15, I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. And so this idea of him being a Hebrew was known to the cupbearer, but that would have been a brand new concept, that there was a group of people called Hebrews. And even calls it the land of the Hebrews, even though they haven't received the land yet. but he's faithfully recognizing it as their land. And so now he's called a Hebrew youth, which we know later on they're going to be very well known in the days of Moses. And so Pharaoh brings Joseph out. When he finds out that there's a man who can interpret dreams, they clean him up, shave. He's shaved and prepared to go before the king. And what does Joseph say when he says that, I've heard that you can interpret dreams? What does Joseph say?
Right?
It wasn't him, it was God.
That's right. Not me.
Takes every opportunity he can to deflect any kind of praise to himself. It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Just a great example. And how can we follow that same example? We don't get miraculous dream interpretations, but what can we do?
And when we answer of it. No?
Follow Jesus' example. The scriptures say, or asking, what do the scriptures say?
Yeah, Sam?
Just thought it was interesting to note that Daniel says the same thing to Nebuchadnezzar
Oh, yeah.
as well.
Absolutely.
So I'll read it real quick. This is chapter 2, verses 26 and 27.
Okay.
The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mystery, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days." So that's pretty cool. It's like the exact same thing.
Yeah.
He makes a very powerful point there. And he is a wise young man who's knowledgeable in the scriptures, knows the story of Joseph, right, in the law of Moses, and is able to do the exact same thing. And so we should follow their example as well. Take every opportunity to say, I don't have any wisdom. I just know what God has said in the Bible. And you have a Bible too. You can read in your Bible what's the answer to your question. How can I be saved? Well, he gives us the answer. And it's straight from God, from the mouth of God. We don't have to go to your preacher or our preacher to get an answer. We can read it for ourselves and understand the will of God. All right, so question 5. We see the interpretation of these dreams, and I wanted you to notice the repetition. So Joseph gives the interpretation, and we have a pair of dreams. And I hope maybe you noticed that we've had now pairs of dreams 3 times. Because what was the first pair?
Joseph.
Joseph.
What was that, brother? Or was it Francis?
It was Joseph's dreams about his parents and his siblings and
Right.
bowing down.
Yeah, he received 2. Now, the cupbearer and the baker each received 1.
But they came the same night and were given to Joseph together. And then you have Pharaoh. And it's very specific. He has one dream and he wakes up and he goes back to sleep and he receives the second dream. And so what did Joseph say was the significance of the pair?
God will bring it to pass.
God will bring it to pass. Sorry, the verse, where does he say that?
32.
32. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. So there may even be some speed to that as well, where it brings in the idea of quickly.
I just think it's interesting to note. Like I said, I'm filing things away for how do we interpret other visions, other prophetic language in the Bible. But when there's a two-ness, that's significant. Norm?
Yeah, that sense of urgency seems to be associated with this, and we see God do this throughout the Bible whenever he repeats something. Whether it's a command or something like Paul will say this and then this and then this. It's the same thing over and over. That there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of importance, a asterisk, star, on this particular issue.
Yeah, Sam, any thoughts on that? That's very good.
Sorry.
Yeah, this idea of verily, verily, I say unto you. He even repeats the word verily sometimes. It's this, I even think maybe there's a relationship to this on the mouth of on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact shall be established. You've got 2 witnesses. That's the minimum that God uses for certainty. And so he's going to send 2 dreams. You can be sure. This wasn't, one strange dream is interesting. 2 in a row? Okay, we've got a pattern here. Something's happening. This is a message from God. And so, sure enough, these men wake up troubled. There's a message from God, and I don't even understand it. So Joseph gives the interpretation, and what's the wisdom that he relates as he's giving the interpretation to Pharaoh?
Of course, the 7 fat cows are 7 years
of
plenty.
Francis?
God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace.
Okay. Yeah, what verse was that? Oh, sorry, maybe you wrote it down.
I did.
Yeah, I mean, he
gives Pharaoh this good news. In fact, verse 28, it is as I have spoken to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Verse 16, okay? Yep, okay. And in the New American Standard, it says God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. What does yours say?
God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace.
Okay.
Yeah, so Joseph is aware that this is going to be a peaceful, favorable answer. And sure enough, it is. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. If you had some bad news coming in your life, would you like a 7-year warning? Yeah, that would be nice. You could do some preparing. And so that's exactly what Pharaoh is able to do. There's some really bad news coming, but guess what? It's bad news for the whole world, and you're the only one who's going to know that it's coming. Wouldn't that be nice? It's like that Back to the Future. I'm going to grab that almanac, and now when I'm in the future, I've got what happened in the past, or maybe that was the second movie. Yeah.
Pharaoh apparently believes in God and knows that this is going to come to pass, but he has to do something to prepare for those 7 years. And so he goes, Joseph is, apparently God is with Joseph, so yes, Joseph knows what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, verse 38, can we find
A man like this in whom is a divine spirit? Since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. It's very similar to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. It's this elevating of Joseph, but also elevating of Joseph's God in the mind of the king. As we know, a polytheistic king who believes in many gods is now seeing that there's a God who truly knows something. Do you notice the name that Pharaoh gives to Joseph? Verse 45, it's, we learned some of the foreign names of our Old Testament characters. This is one I never remembered. Verse 45, Zaphanath Paneah is his Egyptian name. What does that mean, though? Yeah, there's a few different translations. I think Waldron gives a couple of translations: preserver of life, sustainer of life. But my translation my margin says God speaks, he lives. So it's the idea of life from the source of God, right? Because 7 years of famine would have brought death to his land. And so this is how God preserves life, by sending Joseph. And now Pharaoh and Egypt are able to store up the grain during 7 years of plenty. How much grain were they able to store up? How is it described?
Innumerable.
Yeah,
They were trying to keep good records, as the Egyptians always did, keeping records of what's coming in. But verse 49 says they stopped. They stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. So it wasn't just what was it, 1/5? 1/5 is what Joseph had prescribed. It wasn't just 1/5 of your average gross domestic product. It was 1/5 of abounding years. And so they had a hard time even keeping up. And so they had quite a store. And then when the famine comes, just like Joseph had said it would, people come to Pharaoh and say, we're out of food, what are we going to do? And he says, go to Joseph. What were some of the ways that Joseph was honored by Pharaoh?
Made him the number 2 guy.
Sure, he's given that second in all the kingdom position.
Again, parallel to Daniel, maybe Esther, right? Just this from the bottom to the very top in an instant, right? You see that theme throughout our Bibles. What were some other ways that it described that he was honored?
He was dressed, like he had Pharaoh's signet ring, fine linen clothes.
What's the signet ring?
Symbolize.
Authority.
Authority, right?
Yeah, when you see the seal on the ring in the wax, then you know this is from Pharaoh. So that means he has the rights to sign the checks for Pharaoh, right? He's got the power. You see that symbol throughout our Bibles of a signet ring. So you'll see that again, even in reference to Christ having authority with the signet ring. That's in Zechariah, that prophecy. Anything else?
He rode in the second chariot.
He's in the ship.
Second chariot, right? So is this...
It's this idea of being at the king's right hand. He's the king's right-hand man. Just like has happened twice already in Joseph's life. Right-hand man in the jail, right-hand man in Potiphar's house, because he's trusted and he's blessed by God, right? God was with him. And so you certainly see some elements of Christ in the parallelism there, that he was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh and went from the prison to the right hand of the king, highly exalted. We'll catch up next week with these last, 5 questions, starting with question 7. Thanks, everyone.